Howdy, with this video, I want to go over the romantics just briefly, kind of tell you why they matter. Sometimes when you read them, they might seem, they're very optimistic sometimes, particularly someone like Emerson. They may even seem a little flaky to our our modern taste. But it's a very interesting way of looking at the individual and trying to decide where truth comes from. You kind of see with Emerson, it comes from within us. It's this inner voice that we have that tells you, what you should be doing. And if you can get out of the corrupting influence of society and listen to that inner voice, then you can go out and do great things. You also see it reflected in the poetry of somebody like Walt Whitman. Whitman, all kind of into this idea of self-reinvention, self-rejuvenation. With some of these lines like, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I'm large. I contain multitudes, right? There's a lot going on inside me, and what's being expressed at one point may not be the same thing that's expressed at the next point. And deal with it, right? My duties to myself. This is the song of myself here. That's the name of his poem. So focus on the individual. Very powerful kind of idea. You can see writers like Poe and Hawthorne and Melville kind of questioning some of these ideas. Is that inner voice always a good thing to listen to? What exactly is that? But a very powerful idea about where truth comes from. I want to look at a Danish philosopher, Søren Kierkegaard, writing during this time, and he's a fascinating character. If you ever get a chance to study him, I hope you will. But he was kind of concerned with some of these similar ideas, but in a much different way. He didn't like the way the religion and the culture around him worked. He just didn't think it was a representation of how things should be. And eventually he went back to Socrates and Plato, particularly Socrates' idea of having a daemon within him, a daemon. This inner voice that Socrates said kind of told him when not to do something. It didn't really guide him like Emerson might suggest, but just, if he was about to do something wrong, this inner voice would kind of pop up and tell him not to do it. Got him killed, basically. The Greeks believed truth came through tradition and the religion that's been passed down and things like that. Much like people today. If you're a conservative, what are you conserving, right? But Kierkegaard was looking around, not quite in sync with not in sync at all with the people around him. And he kind of went to this idea about where does truth come from. And he really developed this idea that truth is inner and subjective. And no, that it may sound, well, okay, it is, but it's a very powerful idea. And what he's basically saying is, there may be truth outside of me, but I have to interpret it through whatever filters and experiences and ideas of truth I have. And that's what every individual does. And so truth tends to be almost always inner and subjective. So if you're not quite in sync with the community around you, that's okay. The problem is you're still responsible for what decisions you make based on the truth you see. And according to Kierkegaard, this will produce angst and despair, but also a sense of freedom from not having to have this perfect objective truth you're trying for, but working on how you work with your inner definitions of truth, your inner subjective world. So, when you apply this to something like religion, there may be a God out there and a Bible or whatever, or a Quran or whatever religion you are. But you interpret all that specifically through your own mind and feelings and experiences. And that's really all we have. Other people can tell us what they think truth means to them, but again, you got to interpret that through these inner filters that you have. And this is kind of how truth works. It's a very intense, interesting kind of idea. One passage, he found truth more in line with the teachings of Jesus and his faith. But it wasn't easy. It's not something a lot of religious leaders are going to agree with. You can't just decide what's true and what's not, right? There's something objective out here, but Kierkegaard says yes, but still it has to come through me. It's all I have. And this knowledge that it's imperfect is angst-inducing and might lead me to despair and fear and loathing and all these kinds of unpleasant emotions. One particular passage that fascinated Kierkegaard was Abraham and Isaac in the Bible. And again, nobody gets the religion from a Comp 2 teacher. I'm just going to go through what Kierkegaard was seeing here, right? But in this passage, if you don't remember, I'm going to go through it I'm going to summarize it pretty quickly. But God decides to test Abraham. Of course, Abraham doesn't know this at the time. And he tells him to take his son Isaac, take him to this mountain in the region of Moriah, and sacrifice him there as a burnt offering. In other words, he wants Abraham to kill Isaac and set him on fire. That sounds better the way it's phrased in the Bible, but that's basically what's going on there. And Abraham does it. He takes, gets the stuff together, grabs a son, grabs a couple of guys, and they take off for this mountain. And once they get there, he tells the two people to wait, and he and Isaac go up the mountain. He gets everything ready, and you can kind of see along the way, he doesn't tell the men what he's going to do. There's going to be no external validation for what Abraham thinks he has to do. And in fact, if he told these two guys that came with him, they probably would have stopped him the same way if I told you, hey, I'm going to kill my son and set him on fire over on this mountain over here. You would hopefully call the authorities on me, right, before I did something like that. But they go on the mountain. Even Isaac kind of says, like, hey, where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham kind of gets around that, saying God will provide. It's hard to tell if Abraham's being deceptive here or he's being optimistic. Hopefully, maybe God won't make him go through with this. But Abraham does it. He ties him up, takes out his knife, gets ready to stab his son, and finally an angel comes in and says, whoa, dude, stop. Don't lay a hand on the boy, and he's provided a ram for the sacrifice. And he's given this promise about his descendants, spreading throughout the earth and stuff. But Abraham never talks about this. He never talks to anybody about this. He just kind of hears this command that he obviously probably doesn't understand, and just does it. And Kierkegaard says, no, this isn't something Abraham's going to be able to explain to anybody. Certainly not within any normal moral code that most of us live by. You shouldn't stab your son and set him on fire if you think God says so. We think there's something wrong with Abraham, and we'd arrest him if he actually did it, right? And put him in prison for the rest of his life. So there's no external moral code. There's nothing Abraham has except this inner subjective truth that he has to live by, to the point he would sacrifice his own son. And Kierkegaard kind of says that's it. That's what I'm not going to go out and kill people, but this inner truth that you can kind of attain, even if only briefly, is incredibly important. And he used this as an example. And it's a very fascinating passage. If you ever hear somebody preach on it, people generally struggle trying to get through this, trying to figure out why Abraham would be willing to do that, what God was going after, and all this kind of stuff. But Kierkegaard just found this passage fascinating because of this idea of this inner truth being all we really have, and might be something we can't explain to other people sometimes, or might isolate us from other people. But it's interesting, he never explains to Isaac what happened, or the two guys, and it just the Bible kind of just moves on after that. So, fascinating passage. Some non-Christians find it very disturbing. If you're willing to kill your kid just because you think God told you to, there's something wrong with you. But Kierkegaard's still saying, no, that's not the point of the passage. And this very romantic, strong sense of the individual, kind of bringing about some very difficult questions for us. If truth is inner and subjective, as Kierkegaard suggests, that kind of puts most of our ideas of where truth comes from kind of on its head a little bit. And we have to struggle through that. These ideas are going to come back to us with the existentialists in the 20th century. So, while we're going to hit the realists, are going to kind of dismiss some of this stuff. But it's going to come back, because this question of where truth comes from and how the individual responds to it and interprets it. It's going to be a very fascinating question as we go through the literature. So, yeah. again, you know, this isn't a philosophy class or religion class, but kind of wanted to let you know why the Romantics are very important, and they're still with us today. People still have many of these same ideas, just might be rephrased in a different way. But I'm going to stop there. I wanted to keep this short, but we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.